Hello, this is Kinninigan from RagingReptilian.com. We have one heck of a video today because I've actually compiled research I've been doing over the past years into one massive subject that's highly controversial. It's even made the show of ancient aliens quite a few times, but I'm going to go a little deeper than ancient aliens, including the correct deciphering of all the occult pagan symbolism that we're going to be looking at, and we are going to be looking at a lot of it from not so much Sumerian, but I'm going to give the Sumerian history of Baalbek. Baalbek is the correct word. We're not here for linguistics. It's more about the occult nature of this site. But yes, this is Baalbek, back when it was ruled by the Canaanites, which also housed ancient temples. But there is a complex here known as Heliopolis when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. We're going to talk a little bit about him too, and I'm even going to show you some interesting things in his tomb until it eventually became conquered by the Romans, where the Temple of Jupiter, the Temple of Bacchus, and a lesser known temple that's not really talked about too much but is more interesting to me because it's a smaller temple, and that is the Temple of Venus, which is also at this complex. One of the biggest mysteries, obviously, is some of the original foundation stones and even some of the stones used for the construction of the Temple of Jupiter could not have been done by humans, period. Not only that, but the granite used, for example, in the stone columns at Baalbek by the Romans was originally taken from a rose granite quarry in Aswan, Egypt. That's 900 miles away. Some of the stone columns, and I'm actually going to, we're going to go through and look at a whole bunch of stuff here, and I'm actually going to explain everything in detail as I go through everything, including how Roman columns were constructed, not how they were actually lifted, but just how they're actually built in segments, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And we have some really good up-close pics of the Temple of Bacchus that show that. There's also some interesting symbolism on these temples, including very reptilian avian sculptures. And I'm also going to show what the difference between reptilian symbolism is and demonic symbolism, especially Roman demons, and what Roman demons actually look like. They would be the archons, and I'll explain to you how it's represented through different pagan art. We're even going to look at a statue taken out of the Temple of Bacchus that comes back from Rome. Highly disturbing, and it also shows depictions of quote-unquote the hounds of hell, including the Eye of the Illuminati on some other older demonic pagan art I got from Jerusalem. I'm going to go through the browsers here and basically show you what I'm going to be covering in this. And why this is so controversial is because when we start looking at the pictures, I'm going to explain to you a little history of Baalbek. Now, I have an article pulled up here, but I'm using this mainly for reference. I'm not going to read all this because I thought it'd be more interesting if you heard my interpretation of everything we're going to be looking at this site. But I'll leave all these links in the description. So rather than read this article, including this, yes, the obvious lion symbolism, heavily used in Greek, Roman, and even Sumerian mythology. It was a symbol of Alexander the Great also. In fact, one of the quotes that he was known for was saying, "I don't fear an army of lions led by a sheep. I fear an army of sheep led by a lion." And what's interesting about the tomb of Alexander the Great, who conquered this site from the Canaanites and called it Heliopolis, which means land of the sun, direct reference to sun worship too. Alexander the Great had heavy ties into Egypt through a lot of the conquering that he did. He's one of the most famous military generals in history. At his tomb here, they found his tomb recently, and suspiciously the heads and wings are cut off these griffins. I've been covering quite a great deal of mystosynchronism on my channel with hidden symbolism in movies, and this is a symbol of Saturnalian or reptilian worship, these griffin symbols, and these sit above his tombs, representing that he would have been a reptilian shapeshifter, which made sense. Here's a movie from the 80s, very familiar of, called The Never-Ending Story, and these were the oracles in the story. These ones have goat feet, not like lion feet like the griffins, but obvious direct, and then you see the asp, the serpent symbol right on the head here, and the wings. And then, now, this movie, The Never-Ending Story, came out years before, well, before the admitted excavation of his tomb, the tomb of Alexander. This was only found recently. And suspiciously, the heads and wings are cut off these griffin statues here. So this is what I mean by, we're going to get into a lot of detail. Now, the temples that are most well known here at this complex of Baalbek. We're going to get into the three of them. The Temple of Venus, the least known one at the complex, but this one is one of the most interesting, and I'm going to explain the reason why when we go over this. Infamously, the Temple of Jupiter, and what can't be explained is the construction of these columns here. These columns are roughly around 65 feet high and 8.5 feet thick, made by rose granite from that quarry I told you in Aswan, Egypt. They were traveling 900 miles. What's interesting about that is around the Temple of Jupiter, there were roughly around 104 of these columns. Now, you start thinking about the amount of material that is to move 900 miles. And not only move it, carve it, and construct it and put it into place. And you also notice the size of the Temple of Jupiter also. So, these were not built from a local quarry like the Parthenon in Greece was made from limestone. The columns there from local quarries. These were brought in from a quarry, like I said, in Aswan, Egypt. Then infamously, the Temple of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, intoxication, and orgy, this is the temple dedicated to orgy, not suspiciously the Temple of Venus, as some might think. There's something more interesting going on with the Temple of Venus, and it relates to the Dracospita, this video I made recently. These are the Greek quote-unquote dragon houses from ancient Greece, which ties in a lot of the time period. We were just talking about Alexander the Great. Draco is the Greek word for dragon. These houses, there are 25 of them. They can't explain why they were constructed. They're made out of stone, and they all suspiciously have these holes on the top. I made a case that possibly some of these gods or deities were coming down in these Dracospita houses and taking their human form before they came out. And amazingly enough, too, we have the same kind of similar construction going on with the Temple of Venus that comes out right to the complex of Baalbek. Here's what the layout of the complex looks like. As per the, this was like the best representation I could find of this. A lot of these sites that were built upon, this valley here would have originally been ruled, and the temples here originally would have been Babylonian, Canaanite, or Assyrian Babylon. Those temples don't exist, but the foundation stones to where that original complex was, or the Heliopolis complex, still does exist. And we know the Romans didn't put those stones into place. One, they're older, and some of the foundation stones, for example, are 450 tons. We can't even move them with modern machinery. They're bigger than a lot of the stones used in the construction of the Great Pyramid also. And they hold the foundation. You imagine the weight of the Temple of Jupiter. And they would have made... It's easier to explain when I go through the pictures of what I mean. It's old construction with new construction on top. The only ruins that we have are the Roman ruins. And the way the complex is laid out is we have the Temple of Jupiter here, the Great Court, the hexagonal forecourt. This is the Temple of Bacchus and the Temple of Venus down here. Now these are all made using quote-unquote sacred geometry. I gave a lecture on that on my channel about sacred geometry. These temples here are built in the same exact, for example, same ratio. This is the ratio they use. This rectangle right here. Same way that Masonic temples are built, the Temple of Solomon, all the ancient temples are built in the same ratio, using quote-unquote sacred geometry. Now here's where we have the little Temple of Venus, and it comes out to the complex here, basically. So very interesting things going on here. Now some of the art, for example, that comes out of these Roman temples, I'm going to show you that briefly, and then we'll get into more detail of that. This is a depiction of Bacchus as a child, the infant Bacchus, the god of wine. It was in the former collection of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. A lot of elitists hold these authentic pagan art pieces suspiciously, just like they own a lot of the museums where they're housed in. Now this is in the British Museum in London. This is the faun right here. I'm going to give you a little lesson in pagan demonology right here. These are the hounds at the barrier, spoken of in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. When you make a 9-foot magic circle and start adding the angles inside is when you start invoking the quote-unquote hounds of the barrier. That's these hounds here. This infant here being held is Bacchus. I know it's very disturbing, but in the Roman pantheon, demons are represented not specifically as children. I need you to think more in the aspect ratio of a child, but think of like an alien gray, having a more adult head on a smaller frame body. So this is the faun right here. The depiction of grapes and wine and food. This is Bacchus as an infant. And here is the hounds of the barrier right under him. And yeah, this is authentic Roman art here. So what gets interesting, here's some demonic art I pulled out of Calares, City of Demons, going back to Jerusalem, who also has heavy ties in Babylonian paganism, Roman paganism, Canaanite, basically all the areas, and even Egyptology of all things. You can see the Eye of Ra right there. And what's interesting going on in this picture is the demon here is exactly how I explained how Roman demons are depicted. Childlike bodies with very like adult looking heads. Now more mystosynchronism. Mel Gibson showed this in The Passion of the Christ. This was the depiction of Lucifer that we got as Jesus was being condemned, as he was being walked through. It was a demon with the body of a toddler with this very old-looking, evil face. Mel Gibson knew what he was talking about when he made this movie, because this is an authentic mosaic going back to the time of Jerusalem from the City of Demons. Now you'll see the avian symbol here, the bird, poking into the eye. Reptilian symbolism. The trident is over here. It's a scorpion here. Remember, it was a scorpion. Scorpion men are also mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, going back to Babylon. There's a lot of symbolism going on with the scorpion symbol. We have the obvious snake symbol right here, sign of Enki. The hounds at the barrier, and the obvious avian reptilian symbolism right here. And this is authentic time period demonic art from around the early times. And this is how demons were depicted, and I believe that these were alien grays that they were actually depicting, or the archons, or archonic possession. Okay, so now that we went over some of the what real demons look in pagan art. Because as we go through some of the architecture of these temples, I'll be able to explain a little more about the eagle and Alpha Draconian symbolism. We have some really good ones from the Temple of Bacchus. That's the most intact temple, which is why we have the best pictures of it. But I thought that would be an interesting lesson there in the difference between what the griffin symbol represents, that's Saturnalia worship, or Alpha Draconian reptilian. Then you have these deities here who look more like children with adult faces, and these are what I believe are depictions of alien greys or archons in Greek and Roman times, and even Jewish, as we see here. Now, the construction of the Temple of Jupiter and Temple of Bacchus. Temple of Venus, when we look at that, I showed you a pic of that. That could have easily been done by Romans. They built more impressive temples in Rome that we have accounts of and the writings of them. Well, one thing I want to show you, this is Antoninus Pius. My Latin is not that great. It was thought that Nero was the Roman emperor who was in power during the construction of the temples here, but no, it actually ties back to this gentleman right here. This is a bust that we have of him. You'll notice the wings over the head right there. Reptilian shapeshifter symbolism. No, a lot of the emperors in Rome would have been. So the where I got that history from, obviously, the Hellenistic age. This is what I was telling you about. When Alexander the Great conquered the land from the Canaanites, or the Phoenicians, as they were also known. And he named it Heliopolis, which means sun city. Helios means sun in Greek, polis is city. Obvious Egyptian influence there from Alexander the Great conquered a great deal of the Middle East, but the Bible, this does go all the way back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They would have been the ones who built the original temples here, the Canaanites. Then we have, but what's very interesting, here, let me show you one of these quote-unquote gargoyles from the Temple of Jupiter here. Because what gets very interesting about the Roman history is it's very difficult. Yeah, the lion symbol again. These are what remains of the Temple of Jupiter. What's up here? You know, it's amazing at how large this temple is. Stuff was so well hand carved, you wouldn't have been able to see it by the naked eye down at the ground. But it gives you an idea of just some of the size of the detail, like in the carvings here, and the obvious reoccurring. The lion symbol can easily be traced back to Babylon. There are lions on the gates of Ishtar, and are spoken in quite a few Sumerian tablets. So, through this article here, which I'll also leave in the description, basically they could tie in more or less that they believe this would have been during the time of 138 to 161 that Antoninus Pius constructed the Temple of Jupiter, and also completed the great court that I showed in that picture there. The Temple of Venus, which could have easily been built by the Romans, that's not a very impressive temple for the construction. That might be very impressive for what the actual use of it was, and I believe it was for some type of craft to land on top of, just like the Dracospita houses in Greece. And then, in her human form, the goddess Venus would have came from the temple. The actual orgy rituals and all that would have happened in the Temple of Bacchus. I'm expecting at the Temple of Jupiter would have been more human sacrifice going on there. Or quite possibly that temple was built to cater to giants. There's also another interesting thing about the layout of the temple. I noticed this too. The actual size of the planet Venus in regards to the size of the planet Jupiter, we also have a very interesting ratio going on here with the sizes of the temples as well. And then the temple of Bacchus being quite smaller. But what's interesting about this, and where the reason why this made ancient aliens of all places, is they cannot explain, and we're going to look at pictures next. We're going to start actually looking at the temples here, where I'll be able to explain more stuff to you, because I can actually show you what I mean by this. It's how they put these stones in place. Even how the Romans did it, and the Romans don't leave any account of how they actually constructed this temple. The one of the temple of Bacchus or the temple of Jupiter. Because some, like I showed with the pillar stones, we're going to take a look at the size of these stones. They're massive. They're like 6.5 tons apiece. And they had to move them 900 miles from a quarry in Aswan, Egypt, for the rose granite they used in this construction, which means this was a very sacred site to them as well. This site, I believe, the whole site of Baalbek or Heliopolis, actually lays on an occult ley line, which would have made sense as why the Canaanites and Babylonians were in control of it first, built temples here. It was then conquered by Alexander the Great, and then eventually by the Romans. And they all had a great interest in the site, and obviously did a lot of construction at this site dedicated to quote-unquote the gods. Now, the temple of Jupiter probably would have also been dedicated to the Greek goddess Hera also, who was Jupiter's wife, very high up in their pantheon. So let's start looking at some of these temples here. Now obviously these are the ruins from the temple of Venus. What I find very, very interesting is that this could have easily been done by Romans, very easily. This is not built on the same complex. Like I said, it was off to the side. This is how the inside would have been laid out. Now they say there's a dome over the top here, a dome. That's what I find very suspicious. Pillars are 33 feet by 8 inches. Yeah, very heavy occultic symbol. These pillars here, very, but the one thing that that baffles the mind about this is it looks like the ancient ziggurats, and going back to the video I made about these in Greece, the Dracospita houses that they can't explain, that were stone houses with holes cut through the roof. And I made the assumption that it was probably because there's only 25 of these houses on an island in the Aegean Sea, I believe. Is the actual map. The Dragon's House is in Greece. Video is on my channel about this. I go into much more detail about it. My theory was some type of craft was landing on these houses, and the reptilian deities were coming through these houses in their human form, which would make sense for what the Temple of Venus was actually being used for. Now, I look at the inside, 32 feet. You need 9 feet in circumference to make a magic circle for black magic incantation. So they have enough room in the side for perfect circles. They could have even done blood sacrifices in this Temple of Venus. It would have made sense, as Thoth said in the Emerald Tablets, these reptilian deities were summoned through blood magic. Who knows, they could have even cloaked their craft, landed on the roof, and then, they come through the temple after a ritual. They come out of the temple in their godlike form. And these are the same types of temples I was talking about in ancient Babylon, that each of the Anunnaki had to rule over their different jurisdictions. So it's kind of like different constructions at different sites, the ziggurats. And why this temple to Venus? Venus is a very high up god in the Roman pantheon, the goddess of love. Venus is also represented by Lucifer in the occult, of all things. That is the planet Venus in the occult, or the light bearer. So I believe this temple right here would have strictly been used for black magic incantation invocation, and allowing a deity to come into their human form, probably through a sacrifice that was in there. So I'll go through some of the pics here from the ruins here. It's the construction wise, these pillars weren't built in segments. They're only 33 feet high, like I showed you. They're very easily done for the Romans. You'll also notice that the windows they have windows put in here as indentations, but they're stoned out also, just like with the dragon houses. So they can completely seal this temple off from anyone seeing what's going on inside. See the windows here? No windows. They're just pretty bizarre. And of course it comes out to the complex at Baalbek. Now the next one we're going to look at here is the Temple of Jupiter. This is what remains of these 6 pillars here. These pillars are built in segments of the rose quartz granites from Aswan, Egypt. They're 8.5 feet thick, roughly by about 10 feet tall. And they weigh a massive amount. And we have no Roman recollection of how they actually constructed this, or how they lifted them. I've seen quite a few documentaries done on, that's not the one. One of the theories was they used Roman cranes that they had available at the time, but then after they did the mathematics for that, they figured out it would have took 17 of these Roman cranes to be around the circle just to lift up each one of these segments to these pillars here. And secondly, the Roman cranes could not get up to 66 feet high. Impossible. And they also don't explain how they traveled on the 900 miles. So, and what else I find amazing too is, even though it's the largest out of all of them, the Temple of Jupiter we have the least amount of ruins for. They say it was because of earthquakes or whatever, but amazingly these 6 pillars here stood the test of time. A lot with the what's going on in other ancient sites, like recently, and I actually pulled that link up, is like in Palmyra, Syria. This is a pic I was able to find from Palmyra, Syria, another Roman site, the one that was recently blown up by ISIS, of all people. This is what the site originally looked like in 1867, before we had, these are authentic Roman sculptures from there, from the time. And what's a shame too is a lot of this, I see writing behind there, it looks, wow, really neat. And what's a shame is if they don't wind up in museums, a lot of these pieces of art here go on the black market and wind up in the hands of elitists, the Rothschilds, Kissingers. They claim to quote unquote blow these sites up, but they also take a lot of these architecture for themselves, and it sits in their mansions in the States. There's a huge black market for it among the elite. So this was in Palmyra, Syria. Roman construction, still pretty impressive. And this is sadly what the site looks like. Recently in ISIS, yeah, they blew up a lot of these columns here and all that stuff. So we know that, you know, like I said, the building of the Temple of Venus was very doable for the Romans, but they can't explain the Temple of Jupiter, period. Now the one we'll be getting into next, that we're going to go through a lot of pictures on and see a lot of the reptilian architecture, where it's actually going to get quite fun, is the Temple of Bacchus. And what I want to do to you is explain to you, I did a video before on what Bacchus is and what Bacchus rituals are. That is basically, Bacchus is the Roman god of wine, intoxication, orgy, homosexuality, and even cross-dressing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay, now we are going to look at pictures of the temple of Bacchus, and this is going to be one of the most interesting parts of the video because I'm actually going to be able to show you the actual archaeology and explain to you what's going on at the same time. Now what I did here, and I'll put this in the description as a link, and what this is, these are pics that I was able to get off Google, off their search index, and I got them put together in like a slideshow here, because there's going to be quite a few interesting pics show up. Now a lot of these pics are in HD too, so this is really good. And even the construction of the pillars for the temple of Bacchus are still impressive. These could have more realistically been done with the Roman cranes I was talking about, but they can't easily explain that for quote-unquote the temple of Jupiter. This gives you an idea of the size here of the layout. I mean, it's just the construction here is massive. Now these are from some of the reliefs where the columns stand at the top here that have fallen down. And you'll see the amount of detail that's even put into the carving of these buildings, which is barely visible by the naked eye. All filled with sacred geometry and all types of interesting symbols. The lion is a reoccurring thing in these, I would call it a buttress. That's, in roofing, that's what you would call, you know, I guess, yeah, buttress is what I'm going to call it. This is the top of the pillars here. Sections of it have fallen down over the years. And obviously, even under here, in these little squares, they have carvings of different types of animals. And that looks like a bird right there. It's hard to tell. These are weathered down. Obvious lion. Now these stones here, this is all Roman construction. This was easily done by Romans. Not as impressive as some of the other stones that we're going to be taking a look at. Now, who is Bacchus? Bacchus is the Roman god of wine, intoxication, and orgy. Basically, imagine those types of rituals today is what Stanley Kubrick was showing in the Eyes Wide Shut scene during the infamous sex scene ritual. Now, in both Rome and Greece, all parts in plays and acts were played out by male actors, which is where we get cross-dressing in secret societies. Now, obviously, I'm showing you this. I said, there's the hexagram right there. Can't tell what's in the middle of that. That's weathered down. Just under the amount of detail that goes into these temples here is mind-boggling. And yeah, reoccurring symbolism that we see even to this day, especially the hexagram, which is directly related to Saturnalia worship, which is what I was showing you with the griffins. Some of the larger blocks here I was talking about, even these are quite impressive to be moved. But that was a show that was probably being held there. Overview of the complex. Arab graffiti, interesting. These are some of the older stones that were on the site coming from the Canaanites, the ones that were quite larger, that the Romans, they weren't put there by the Romans. These are the older ones that go all the way back to the Canaanites. They would have had Babylonian temples on this site, and like I said, they would use these base stones to support the weight of the complex without sinking into the dirt, more or less. So how they were able to do that, and some of these foundation stones at the complex, the original stones, a lot of them are buried, or some of them get up to 450 tons. We'll look at some better pics of them. The steps here, obvious steps made for humans. Yes. Here's some of the stones on the side that I was talking about, the larger ones. And you can see how big these are in comparison to even just where the platform is for the Temple of Bacchus. Okay, here's the pic I was looking for. Now, not as big as the pillars on the Temple of Jupiter, obviously, but this is one of the bases for the Temple of Bacchus. And this is typically, these are two pictures spliced together. That's why this looks split in the middle. That's just, whoever took this picture, this is a big HD pic, and they spliced together two pictures, it looks like. Did a bad job of it, but I want to show you. This is, they would construct this base. Then you have this hole that would be cut out in the middle. Now, they wouldn't use metal, because metal would obviously rust and bleed out colors and deteriorate. They would have just used wood, naturally. And all that wood would have been used for is to stick in that hole as a dowel. And to set the next section of the pillar, these would have been made in about 5 or 6 pieces. These ones at the Temple of Bacchus, they look roughly about 6 feet thick at the bottom. The ones at the Temple of Jupiter are 8.5 feet thick, and roughly anywhere from probably 6 to 8 feet tall. And they would have just put them on top of each other in sections and used these holes that were cut in there. It was one of the secrets to Roman construction, was cutting holes in stone and using wooden dowels. Wood will break down naturally over time, and it was more or less just to set the stone into place. And without using metal also. Metal can grind down stone and all that. Wood is more or less harmless. So they would just basically use these dowels and stack these pillars up on top of each other. No cement was needed. The sheer weight of each section of the pillar held itself in place in conjunction with the wooden dowel, which really wasn't holding the weight of the pillar. It was just keeping it stationary so they could set it into place. But even these are quite impressive when you think about the amount of time it would have taken to carve and construct and move. This is some of the inside of the temple. Yes. Is there? Here we have some of the pagan art here. Now I can make out this. This is a fauna or a goat. Those are goat legs. And suspiciously, as it comes up to here, we don't see that much of the face. It's been weathered off. But the legs are intact. Those are goat legs. Pick of the pillars. Probably some of the original art found around the temple. Fresco right there. There's going to be a pic coming up quite soon. Things will get really interesting. See, here's some of the holes that are cut in the middle of those pillars, like I was telling you about, that they use the dowels to set them in place with. More detail of the underneath of these buttresses, like I said. You wouldn't have been able to see that from the ground with the naked eye. Here's the pic that gets really interesting. Yes, okay. This is from the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek. And what do we have here? Obvious. Now, this one, it's not really an eagle. It looks more like a dragon's head. Now, I can't turn the picture sideways, but we don't need to, really. We're just going to decode some of the obvious reptilian symbolism here. Babylonian reptilian symbolism, too. That's the Cardaceus. This is the symbol of Enki, the 2 serpents wrapped around the staff, and that's also the staff of Hermes. Here we have, this head here looks more dragon-like than eagle. And this is the imperial sign of Rome, also was the eagle. Heavily used there. Some of the sacred geometry too. Yeah, we have the flower right there. This one is 5-petal. And then you can see all this like small carving detail. This you can't get any more obvious towards reptilian Babylonian symbolism right there, going all the way back to the Anunnaki. The eagle this is why it's our national symbol today. I've made quite a few videos on the symbolism of the eagle and its obvious reference to Enki and Enlil. As we see right here, it's sitting on a key, what appears to be a key, but it's shaped like a key. This same key that this eagle is sitting on is even displayed, of all things, in the court of the Vatican. I will be making a video about the architecture and art, if you want to call it art, including Reptilian Hall at the Vatican in the very near future, don't worry. Baalbek has been a place I've been wanting to cover for quite a while, and I've been doing quite a lot of research into the architecture here. But that is obvious reptilian. There's some other stones I want to show you here. Okay, see, here's more of the dowels. Yeah, what I was talking about, the construction of the pillars. This looks like a close-up of the rose quartz granite that they were carving from Aswan, Egypt, from that quarry. They moved 900 miles. That's what that looks like. And it's going to be all. Like I said, this link will be in the description. Now, what else I wanted to show you? Is some of the original foundation stones of the complex. The ones that they can't explain. That is these right here. We're going to enlarge this. These stones here, the foundation stones, are the ones that go all the way back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Canaanites. These ones right here, some of these foundation stones, as I said, these are like the bedding of the entire complex that held the weight of the temple of Bacchus, Jupiter, and the grand court, the hexagonal court, and all that stuff I showed you, which is, you imagine the tonnage that these stones are just supporting and how heavy they are themselves. And we can't explain how they were built. So the story is, yes, we don't know. It's been heavily theorized. Like I said, it's even made ancient aliens. But it's no recurring theme when you study ancient mythology like this. We get too many of these complexes. Here's one right here. This is a stone that was probably taken out during the construction of this time. They call it the pregnant woman because of the way it sits, like it has a belly right here. And here's a human standing on it right there. Look at the size of this. How are they moving these stones? These look like lines that they probably put into where it was being cut somehow. It's just, how are they moving these stones? We could barely move this thing with a modern crane. I mean, this is an aerial view of the entire complex. This is what I meant by all this original foundation stone that's all sitting around this complex is all comes from Canaanite times. Just massive. Another look at the great foundation stones at Baalbek. So, you know, the Roman construction that's even on top of this older Canaanite construction, they can't even explain the Roman construction or the Greek construction, which is really mind-bending because, as I said, we can explain the Temple of Venus. That's a much smaller temple. Even a lot of the hand-carved reliefs that I was just showing you from the Temple of Bacchus, Romans were capable of that. They did it all the time. They were very good with carving in stone. But these foundation stones right here cannot be explained at all. And why was this site so sacred and sought after by the Greeks and the Romans? And why was it conquered? I believe it lays on a major occultic ley line. By no coincidence. Well, that's often been theorized with this place. So this is another link I'll leave in the description for you if you're curious and want to read about this. And a lot of these pictures here you can enlarge. I paused the video and I wanted to pull this. This is one of my favorite pics, that probably all the pics that we looked at today, because you get a view of the columns of the Temple of Jupiter in the background there, and a close-up of the buttresses that's holding those pillars up, and just the amount of detail that's going into the architecture here, including even these little sculptures here that you would not even be able to see from the ground. I hope you enjoyed all the different symbolism I went through. Greek and Roman and Babylonian and even Egyptian to a degree, and I'll be getting into Egyptian sites in the very near future. But a lot of them have the same reoccurring themes in the architecture. The only thing that comes of interest with for example, the Draco Spitted houses I was showing in Greece is Draco or dragon is not too often used in Greek, and there isn't even too many Greek deities that are dragons. And then obviously in Rome, they're using these symbols of the griffin, and that obviously avian bird-looking symbol I showed you holding the staff of Enki. And also I showed you what authentic people say they're demons, but again, they're not demons. These are what demons look like in ancient times. So I wanted to go through and just, like I said, that was one of my, I'll put all these links in the description of the articles I used here for reference. I wanted to get more into the architecture and the wonders of this site, how old the site actually goes back to, which is Babylon. Who took control of the site from Alexander the Great to Antoninus, the Greek general and emperor, who has the obvious eagle symbol right on his crest on that statue I showed you. This is why I say I can refer to a lot of the same Sumerian gods into the same pantheons, whether it was like the lecture I was giving on Tartarus with Greece or with Rome. And I wanted to, I've been wanting to talk about Baalbek, I'm sorry, like I said, not too much of linguistics. It's the same site given different names. We'll call it Heliopolis, just, you know. That was the Greek name for it, City of the Sun. Obvious reference to the sun god Ra, too, in that case. The Greek sun god is Helio, or Helios, that's why you get that, and the Roman sun god is Mithros, or Mithra, which is where we get the Mithra or sun cults from. I could obviously, and I will too in the future, get into the more pagan aspects and the rituals of Bacchus, because it's pretty disturbing. The Bacchus rituals are not as, it's not just wine and intoxication. It goes into a lot more disturbing things. That's why there was an entire temple built, and it would have been a lot of human sacrifice, orgy, intoxication. Obviously, the Temple of Venus, being the smallest one here, was not used for those things, although you would think so, and hearing just the name Venus. This was what I believe, quite possibly UFOs were landing on top of, and they would come out of these temples in their human form. And then, of course, the obvious, the Romans don't even have any accounts of how they did it, and the Romans kept excellent records. They would have been proud of an achievement like this. But yet we have no written records of how they moved these stones from the quarry in Aswan, Egypt, constructed this temple of Jupiter. And even the temple of Bacchus is a feat in itself. Even though it's smaller, it's still a lot of, there's a lot of columns on that one too, I showed you. And also made from the same rose quartz, from the same quarry. They haven't explained how they moved the material for that temple either. You're talking about a lot of stone they moved from 900 miles away in ancient times. They didn't do it on logs with, you know, pushing it with camels through the desert. I highly doubt that. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. If there's any questions or comments, leave them below. Again, if anyone is able to help us out through Patreon or with donations, anything will be appreciated. I've applied for monetization on this channel. I made a video about that, addressing the issue. But my account is still, quote-unquote, under review. We're going on 8 days now, no surprise. I didn't think you two would be too fast to get back to an answer on me, you know, so I wanted to just let people know that, yeah, the monetization has been improved. You probably won't see any ads play on this video, which is why I don't mind asking for donations, because I can give you an hour of information pretty much ad-free, and I enjoy doing lectures like this. As far as the specific deities of these temples, Jupiter, Bacchus, and Venus, I would rather just do more in-depth videos on each one of them and the occult rituals around each of those deities. Venus is an interesting one. She can basically equate out to being Ishtar in Sumeria, who is also represented by the planet Venus. Jupiter is Zeus or Enlil. Bacchus is a little more... there are a few Sumerian deities that Bacchus could actually be. So that one's debatable. I'd rather just do another video about Bacchus and my theories on which deity that could be representing, because there are a few fertility and, for example, I made a video about the Sumerian god of beer, who is Ninkasi. And Ninkasi, well, Bacchus also covers the intoxication of wine and beer, and drugs, and cross-dressing, bisexuality, homosexuality, orgy, basically any type of immoral human pleasure you were thinking of, probably all the way up into human and animal sacrifice, which heavily happened here, was allowed and going on inside this temple at that time. And as far as what was going on inside the temple of Jupiter, which I believe probably was also dedicated to the Greek goddess Hera, who knows? They would have had I know that they would have had a bronze statue in there that would have been going up probably at least 50 feet tall. That would have been close to the inside of the temple. It was a Roman staple where they would make them out of bronze, which is copper and tin. Romans were very good at metallurgy and foundry casting. Foundry is when you make huge bronze statues of that size. And yes, there would have been all types of bronze statues adorning the gods around the site. Unfortunately, none of them mysteriously survived. There's a lot of mysteries with the Temple of Jupiter, I know. The old foundation to the complex at Baalbek is still standing, though. The original Canaanite Babylonian foundation. But mysteriously, the Temple of Jupiter does not stand anymore. Big mysteries. Modern science can't explain them, I know. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. And until we speak again, this is Kinninigan, and take care.